The bitter Minnesota winter had settled in, wrapping the small town of Pine Creek in a blanket of pristine white snow. Margaret Olson, a 70-year-old widow, lived alone in her cozy cabin at the edge of the woods. Her life had fallen into a quiet routine since her husband, Tom, passed away 5 years ago. Each morning, she'd wake up, make herself a cup of strong coffee, and watch the local wildlife from her kitchen window. On this particular morning, however, something was different. As Margaret stirred honey into her steaming mug, a desperate bark pierced the stillness of the winter air. She paused, her spoon suspended mid-stir, and listened. The sound came again, more urgent this time. Margaret set down her coffee and made her way to the back door. She pulled on her warmest coat, a thick red parka that Tom had given her for their 40th anniversary, and wrapped a woolen scarf around her neck. Stepping out onto the back porch, she felt the crisp air nip at her cheeks. The barking grew louder, seeming to come from the edge of the woods behind her property. Margaret's arthritis made her movements slow and deliberate as she descended the porch steps, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across the backyard. As she approached the tree line, Margaret squinted, trying to make out any movement among the snow-laden pines. Then she saw it, a flash of golden fur between the trees. Her heart quickened as she realized it was a dog, and it seemed to be in distress. "Here, pup," Margaret called softly, her breath visible in the frigid air. "It's okay. Come on out." Slowly, cautiously, a golden retriever emerged from the woods. The dog was thin, her coat matted and dirty. But what caught Margaret's attention were the dog's eyes, big, brown, and filled with a desperate plea for help. The retriever whined softly, then turned back toward the woods, as if trying to show Margaret something. Margaret followed the dog's gaze and gasped. There, nestled in the snow at the base of a large pine tree, was a small bundle of fur. As she drew closer, she realized it wasn't just one bundle, but several. 8 tiny puppies, no more than a few days old, huddled together for warmth. "Oh, you poor things," Margaret murmured, her heart aching at the sight. The mother dog looked up at her, tail wagging hesitantly, as if to say, "Can you help us?" Without a second thought, Margaret knew what she had to do. She couldn't leave these creatures out in the cold. Carefully, she knelt down in the snow, ignoring the protest of her aching knees, and began to gather the puppies. They were so small, each fitting easily in one of her mittened hands. "It's okay, Mama," she said soothingly to the golden retriever. "We're going to get you and your babies somewhere warm." It took several trips back and forth from the woods to her house, but finally, Margaret had all 8 puppies safely inside. The mother dog followed closely, her eyes never leaving her pups. Margaret cleared a space near the fireplace, laying down old blankets and towels to create a makeshift bed. As she worked, Margaret's mind raced. Where had this dog come from? How long had she been out in the cold with her puppies? She looked closer at the mother dog and noticed she wasn't wearing a collar. Was she a stray? Or had someone abandoned her? The thought made Margaret's blood boil. How could anyone be so cruel as to abandon a dog, especially one about to give birth? She pushed the anger aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. These animals needed her help, and she was determined to give it. Once the puppies were settled, Margaret turned her attention to the mother dog. "You must be starving, poor thing," she said, making her way to the kitchen. She found some leftover chicken in the fridge and warmed it up, adding a bit of rice. While the food heated, she filled a large bowl with fresh water. The golden retriever watched Margaret's every move, her tail wagging slightly. When Margaret set down the food and water, the dog looked at her, then at the puppies, as if torn between her hunger and her maternal instinct. "Go on," Margaret encouraged. "Your babies are safe. You need to keep up your strength." Seemingly reassured, the dog began to eat ravenously. Margaret sat on the floor nearby, watching as the puppies nestled close to each other, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. They were so vulnerable, so dependent on their mother and now, on Margaret. As the day wore on, Margaret found herself constantly checking on the dogs. She called her neighbor, Bill, and asked him to pick up some puppy formula and dog food from the store in town. Bill, a kindly man in his 60s, was more than happy to help. He arrived a few hours later, his truck loaded with supplies. "My word, Maggie," he said, using the nickname she'd had since childhood. "You've got yourself a full house now." Margaret smiled, feeling more energized than she had in years. "I couldn't just leave them out there, Bill. They wouldn't have survived the night." Bill nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You did a good thing, Maggie. A real good thing." As night fell, Margaret made sure the puppies and their mother were comfortable. She decided to call the golden retriever Grace, a name that seemed fitting for a dog who had shown such strength and devotion to her puppies. "Good night, Grace," Margaret said softly, giving the dog a gentle pat. "You're safe now. You all are." That night, as Margaret lay in bed, she found herself thinking about the twist her life had taken in just one day. The house that had felt so empty for so long was now full of life. She could hear the soft whimpers of the puppies and the occasional movement of Grace checking on her babies. Margaret drifted off to sleep with a smile on her face, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would change her life in ways she never could have imagined. As the first rays of sunlight peeked through her curtains the next morning, Margaret awoke to a new reality. The events of the previous day came flooding back, and for a moment, she wondered if it had all been a dream. But as she made her way downstairs, the soft sounds coming from near the fireplace confirmed that it had indeed been real. Grace lifted her head as Margaret entered the room, her tail thumping gently against the blankets. The puppies were nursing, their tiny bodies pressed close to their mother's warm belly. Margaret knelt down beside them, marveling at the miraculous scene before her. "Good morning, sweet girl," she said softly to Grace, who responded with a gentle lick to Margaret's hand. "Let's see how everyone's doing today." Margaret carefully checked each puppy, counting to make sure all 8 were accounted for. They seemed stronger already, their little voices a bit louder as they squirmed and nursed. Grace watched attentively but remained calm, seeming to understand that Margaret was there to help. As she observed the little family, Margaret's mind wandered to the challenges that lay ahead. These puppies would need constant care and attention in the coming weeks. She thought about her quiet, predictable life and how it had been turned upside down in the span of a day. But as she looked at Grace's trusting eyes and the helpless puppies, she knew she wouldn't have it any other way. With a determined nod, Margaret stood up, her joints creaking slightly. "Well," she said to Grace, "looks like we've got our work cut out for us. But don't you worry. We're going to get through this together." And with that, Margaret began her first full day as an unexpected but willing guardian to 9 dogs, unaware of the profound impact this twist of fate would have on her life and the lives of those around her. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity for Margaret. Her once quiet home now buzzed with the soft whimpers of puppies and the padding of Grace's paws as she tended to her little ones. Margaret found herself falling into a new routine, one that revolved entirely around her unexpected houseguests. Each morning, Margaret would wake up earlier than usual, her body protesting but her mind eager to check on the dogs. She'd make her way downstairs, her slippered feet shuffling across the worn wooden floors, to find Grace already awake and alert. "Good morning, Grace," Margaret would say, her voice still rough with sleep. "How are our little ones doing today?" Grace would respond with a gentle wag of her tail, her eyes never leaving her puppies. Margaret marveled at the dog's devotion, remembering how she herself had felt when her son, David, was born all those years ago. The first order of business was always to check on the puppies. Margaret would carefully count each one, making sure they were all breathing well and staying warm. She'd gently stroke each tiny head, marveling at how they were already growing and changing day by day. "You're doing a great job, Mama," Margaret would tell Grace, offering her a scratch behind the ears. "These little ones are lucky to have you." After ensuring the puppies were okay, Margaret would turn her attention to Grace. She'd fill a bowl with fresh water and prepare a hearty breakfast of dog food mixed with some boiled chicken, a special treat to help Grace keep up her strength. As Grace ate, Margaret would sit nearby on her old rocking chair, sipping her morning coffee and watching the little family. It was in these quiet moments that she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The emptiness that had filled her home since Tom's passing seemed to have been chased away by the pitter-patter of tiny paws and the gentle presence of Grace. But caring for 9 dogs was no easy task, especially for a woman of Margaret's age. She found herself making frequent trips to the local pet store, loading up on puppy formula, extra blankets, and cleaning supplies. The store owner, a friendly woman named Sarah, soon became familiar with Margaret's frequent visits. "How are the little ones doing, Mrs. Olsen?" Sarah would ask, a warm smile on her face. Margaret would beam with pride, pulling out her phone to show the latest pictures she'd taken. "They're growing like weeds," she'd say. "And Grace is such a good mother. You'd never know she'd been out on her own not too long ago." Sarah would listen intently, offering advice and encouragement. "You're doing a wonderful thing, Mrs. Olsen," she'd say. Not many people would take on such a big responsibility. Margaret would wave off the compliment, but inside, she felt a warmth spreading through her chest. It had been a long time since she'd felt this sense of purpose, this feeling that she was making a real difference in the world. Back at home, Margaret settled into a routine of feeding, cleaning, and comforting. The puppies needed to be fed every few hours, a task that Grace handled admirably with Margaret's support. Margaret made sure Grace had plenty of nutritious food and fresh water, watching with satisfaction as the dog's ribs became less visible and her coat regained its golden sheen. The puppies, too, were thriving under their care. Their eyes, tightly shut when Margaret first found them, began to open, revealing tiny glimpses of the world around them. Their wobbly attempts at crawling became stronger each day, and soon they were exploring the confines of their makeshift bed with curious noses and wagging tails. Margaret found herself talking to the dogs constantly, filling the house with chatter in a way she hadn't done since Tom was alive. She'd tell Grace about her day, about the weather, about the birds she'd seen at the feeder outside. She'd coo to the puppies, giving each one a unique nickname based on their personalities. There was Wobbles, the smallest of the litter who always seemed a bit unsteady on his feet. Nosy was always the first to investigate any new smell or sound. Sleepy could often be found snoozing even when his siblings were at their most active. Margaret loved each of them, their unique quirks bringing a smile to her face dozens of times a day. As the days turned into weeks, Margaret's life changed in ways she never expected. Her daily walks, once solitary affairs, now included Grace. The golden retriever, at first hesitant to leave her puppies, soon learned to trust that they would be safe in Margaret's care during their brief absences. These walks became a highlight of Margaret's day. She and Grace would stroll through the snowy landscape, the dog's tail wagging happily as she bounded through snowdrifts and chased the occasional squirrel. Margaret found herself laughing more than she had in years, Grace's joyful energy infectious. The walks also brought Margaret into contact with her neighbors more often. People who she'd only waved to in passing now stopped to chat, curious about the friendly dog at her side. "This is Grace," Margaret would say proudly. "She and her puppies have come to stay with me for a while." Word spread quickly in their small town, and soon Margaret found herself fielding offers of help from all directions. Her neighbor, Bill, would stop by regularly with supplies or just to lend a hand with the puppies. Sarah from the pet store offered to spread the word about the puppies once they were old enough for adoption. Even Margaret's son, David, who lived a few hours away in Minneapolis, called more frequently. "Mom, are you sure you're not taking on too much?" he'd ask, concern evident in his voice. Margaret would chuckle. "Oh, David," she'd say. "I haven't felt this good in years. These dogs, they've given me something to look forward to each day." There was a truth in those words that surprised even Margaret. The dogs had filled a void in her life she hadn't even realized was there. The loneliness that had been her constant companion since Tom's passing had been replaced by a sense of purpose and joy. Of course, it wasn't all easy. There were nights when the puppies cried incessantly, their tiny voices piercing the darkness no matter what Margaret did to comfort them. There were messes to clean up, vet bills to pay, and the constant worry about what would happen when the puppies were old enough to be adopted. But even in those challenging moments, Margaret never regretted her decision to take in Grace and her puppies. Each small victory, a puppy taking its first wobbly steps, Grace wagging her tail and greeting each morning, the feeling of a tiny puppy falling asleep in her lap, made it all worthwhile. As the weeks passed, Margaret found herself changing too. She stood a little straighter, moved a little quicker. The arthritis in her knees still bothered her, but somehow it seemed less noticeable when she was focused on caring for her furry charges. She had more energy, more enthusiasm for each new day. One evening, as Margaret sat in her rocking chair watching Grace nurse her puppies, she realized something profound. In saving these dogs, she had also saved herself. The empty, quiet house that had felt more like a mausoleum than a home was now filled with life and love. Grace looked up at her, those soulful brown eyes seeming to convey a deep gratitude. Margaret reached out to stroke the dog's soft head. "We're in this together, girl," she said softly. "You and me and these little ones. We're family now." And as she sat there, surrounded by the gentle sounds of contentedly sleeping puppies and the rhythmic breathing of Grace, Margaret felt a peace settle over her. She didn't know what challenges tomorrow might bring, but for the first time in a long while, she was looking forward to finding out. This was indeed a new beginning, not just for Grace and her puppies, but for Margaret too. And she was ready to embrace every moment of it. As the harsh Minnesota winter began to soften into spring, life in Margaret's cozy home continued to flourish. The tiny, helpless puppies she had rescued from the snow were growing by leaps and bounds, both in size and personality. What had once been a quiet, somewhat lonely existence for Margaret had transformed into a bustling, joy-filled adventure. Each morning, Margaret would wake to the sound of playful yips and the pitter-patter of little paws on the hardwood floors. She'd make her way downstairs, a smile already on her face, eager to see what new developments the day would bring. "Good morning, my little ones," she'd call out as she entered the living room. Grace would be there, tail wagging, surrounded by her energetic brood. The puppies, now able to see and toddle about on their own, would scramble towards Margaret, each vying for her attention. Margaret had long since given up trying to keep the puppies confined to their original space by the fireplace. They had the run of the house now, their playful antics bringing life to every corner. She'd watch with amusement as they explored, their curiosity seemingly endless. Wobbles, the runt of the litter, had overcome his initial unsteadiness and was now often the first to investigate new things. Margaret would laugh as he'd fearlessly approach the vacuum cleaner, barking his high-pitched puppy bark at the noisy machine. Nosy lived up to her name, her little black nose always twitching as she sniffed out new scents. She had a particular fondness for Margaret's flower garden, now beginning to bloom with the arrival of spring. Margaret had to keep a close eye on her during their outdoor playtimes to make sure she didn't dig up the freshly planted tulips. Sleepy, true to form, could often be found curled up in the most unexpected places. Margaret had lost count of the number of times she'd frantically searched for him, only to find him snoozing contentedly in a laundry basket or under a chair. The other puppies, Spot, Brownie, Goldie, Whiskers, and Buddy, each had their own quirks and charms. Margaret found herself constantly amazed at how 8 puppies from the same litter could have such distinct personalities. Grace, for her part, was flourishing in her role as a mother. Her coat had regained its lustrous golden sheen, and her eyes sparkled with contentment. She watched over her puppies with a mixture of pride and exasperation that Margaret found all too familiar. "They're a handful, aren't they, girl?" Margaret would say, giving Grace an affectionate pat. Grace would respond with a look that seemed to say, "You have no idea," before diving back into the fray to break up a tussle over a chew toy. As the puppies grew, so did the bond between Margaret and Grace. Their daily walks had become a cherished ritual, a time for just the two of them to enjoy each other's company. They'd stroll through the neighborhood, Grace trotting happily at Margaret's side, her leash more a formality than a necessity. These walks had an unexpected benefit. They brought Margaret into regular contact with her neighbors in a way she hadn't experienced in years. People would stop to admire Grace, and the conversation would naturally flow to the puppies and Margaret's unexpected adventure in dog rescue. "You're doing a wonderful thing, Margaret," her neighbor, Ellen, said one afternoon as they chatted over the fence. "This town could use more people like you." Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest at the words. She'd lived in Pine Creek for most of her life, but in the years since Tom's passing, she'd withdrawn from the community. Now, she found herself reconnecting, rediscovering the joy of simple neighborly interactions. Word of Margaret's impromptu dog rescue spread quickly through the small town. Soon, she was fielding visits from curious neighbors, all eager to see the puppies and offer their support. Her front porch, which had stood empty for so long, now often hosted impromptu gatherings as people stopped by with donations of dog food, toys, or simply their time. Margaret's son, David, noticed the change in his mother during his weekly phone calls. "You sound different, Mom," he said one Sunday evening. "Happier," Margaret chucked, watching as Grace attempted to herd her energetic puppies into a semblance of order. "I am happier, David," she replied. "These dogs, they've given me a new lease on life." Indeed, Margaret felt more vibrant and alive than she had in years. The responsibility of caring for Grace and the puppies had given her days structure and purpose. She found herself waking each morning with a sense of anticipation, eager to see what new adventures the day would bring. Her health seemed to be improving too. The aches and pains that had plagued her seemed less noticeable when she was playing with the puppies or taking Grace for a walk. Her doctor, Dr. Thompson, commented on the change during her checkup. "Whatever you're doing, Margaret, keep it up," he said with a smile. "Your blood pressure is down, and you seem to have more energy. These dogs are better than any medicine I could prescribe." As spring bloomed into summer, Margaret's home became a hub of activity. She started hosting weekly puppy playdates in her backyard, inviting neighbors and their children to come and interact with the dogs. The sound of laughter and excited barks filled the air as the puppies romped and played, their joy infectious. These gatherings had an unexpected benefit. Margaret noticed that Grace, while still protective of her puppies, was becoming more comfortable around other people. She would greet visitors with a wagging tail, soaking up the attention and praise lavished upon her. "You're a natural therapy dog, Grace," Margaret would say, watching as the golden retriever gently allowed a toddler to pat her head. Grace would look up at her with those soulful brown eyes, and Margaret would feel a surge of affection for this remarkable dog who had come into her life so unexpectedly. The puppies, too, were thriving with the increased socialization. They learned to play gently with children, to come when called, and to sit patiently for treats. Margaret beamed with pride at their progress, feeling every bit like a proud grandmother. As the puppies grew, Margaret knew she would eventually need to find homes for them. The thought brought a pang to her heart. She had grown to love each of these little balls of fur. But she also knew that they deserved homes where they could be the center of attention, not just one of 8. She began to quietly put out feelers in the community, wanting to ensure that each puppy would go to a loving, responsible home. The response was overwhelming. It seemed everyone in Pine Creek wanted to adopt one of Margaret's miracle puppies. "You'll need to set up interviews," Sarah from the pet store advised. "Make sure they're going to good homes." Margaret took the advice to heart, setting up a rigorous screening process for potential adopters. She wanted to make sure that each puppy would be loved and cared for as much as she had loved and cared for them. As she went through this process, Margaret found herself reflecting on the incredible journey of the past few months. She thought about that cold winter morning when she had first heard Grace's desperate barks. How close she had come to ignoring the sound, to missing out on this amazing adventure. Looking around her living room, now strewn with dog toys and puppy beds, Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude. These dogs had brought so much joy and purpose into her life. They had helped her reconnect with her community, had given her a reason to get up each morning with a smile on her face. Grace padded over to where Margaret sat, resting her head on Margaret's knee. Margaret stroked the dog's soft ears, marveling at the bond they had formed. "We've come a long way, haven't we, girl?" she said softly. Grace looked up at her, those expressive brown eyes seeming to convey understanding and affection. As the sun set on another busy day, Margaret watched the puppies curl up for the night, their little bodies nestled against Grace. The scene of contentment before her filled her heart with warmth. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever changes were to come, Margaret knew one thing for certain: her life had been immeasurably enriched by this unexpected twist of fate. She had set out to save these dogs, but in truth, they had saved her too. Together, they were not just surviving, but thriving, each day bringing new joys and discoveries. And Margaret couldn't wait to see what tomorrow would bring. As the warm days of summer began to give way to the crisp air of autumn, Margaret knew the time had come to face a bittersweet reality. The puppies, now nearly 3 months old, were ready to find their forever homes. While the thought of parting with them tugged at her heartstrings, Margaret understood that this was the best thing for the energetic young dogs. One morning, as she sat on her porch swing with Grace at her feet, Margaret made the call she'd been both anticipating and dreading. "Dr. Emily? It's Margaret Olson. I think it's time we started finding homes for our puppies." Dr. Emily, the local veterinarian who had been instrumental in caring for Grace and her litter, responded with enthusiasm. "That's wonderful, Margaret. I've already had several people asking about them. Why don't you come by the clinic this afternoon, and we can start putting together a plan?" As Margaret hung up the phone, she felt a mix of emotions wash over her. Pride in how far the puppies had come, excitement for the new adventures that awaited them, and a twinge of sadness at the thought of saying goodbye. Grace, sensing her mood, rested her head on Margaret's lap, offering silent comfort. "It's okay, girl," Margaret said, scratching behind Grace's ears. "We always knew this day would come. We've done our job, now it's time to find them families who will love them as much as we do." That afternoon, Margaret made her way to the veterinary clinic, a folder of notes and photos tucked under her arm. As she entered, the bell above the door chimed, and Dr. Emily greeted her with a warm smile. "Margaret, come on back to my office," the vet said, leading the way. "I can't wait to hear all about how our little ones are doing." Over the next hour, Margaret and Dr. Emily pored over Margaret's meticulous notes about each puppy's personality, quirks, and needs. They laughed over stories of Wobble's newfound confidence and Nose's continued fascination with Margaret's garden. "You've done an amazing job with them, Margaret," Dr. Emily said, her eyes twinkling. "These puppies are going to make wonderful companions." Together, they crafted a plan. They would hold an adoption event at the local community center, where prospective families could meet the puppies. But before that, they would conduct thorough screenings and home visits to ensure each pup would be going to a loving, suitable home. As word spread about the upcoming adoption event, Margaret found herself fielding calls and visits from excited community members. It seemed everyone in Pine Creek wanted to adopt one of the miracle puppies, as they had come to be known. Margaret took her role as the puppy's guardian seriously. She created a detailed questionnaire for potential adopters, covering everything from their living situation to their experience with dogs. She wanted to make sure each puppy would be going to a home where they would be loved and cared for properly. The day of the adoption event arrived, crisp and sunny. Margaret arrived at the community center early, her station wagon packed with puppies, Grace sitting regally in the front seat. As she set up the play area, she could hear the excited chatter of people lining up outside. When the doors opened, the room quickly filled with cooing adults and squealing children, all eager to meet the puppies. Margaret watched with a mixture of pride and wistfulness as Wobbles confidently approached a shy little boy, as Nosy sniffed curiously at a young couple's shoes, as Sleepy dozed contentedly in the arms of a grey-haired woman. Throughout the day, Margaret observed the interactions closely, making mental notes about which families seemed to click with which puppies. She found herself getting choked up as she watched Buddy, the largest of the litter, gently play fetch with a little girl in a wheelchair. "He'd be perfect for them," Dr. Emily murmured, noticing Margaret's gaze. "That family's been looking for a dog that could potentially be trained as a service animal." By the end of the day, Margaret had a list of potential matches for each puppy. But she knew the process was far from over. Over the next few weeks, she conducted home visits, wanting to see firsthand where her precious charges might be living. She visited apartments and houses, met other pets, and had long conversations with prospective adopters. Some visits left her feeling confident and excited, while others gave her pause. Margaret wasn't afraid to say no if she felt a home wasn't the right fit, always keeping the puppy's best interests at heart. Through it all, Grace remained a constant source of comfort. The golden retriever seemed to understand what was happening, often nuzzling the puppies as if to say goodbye when they left for their home visits. "You're such a good mom," Margaret would tell her, marveling at the dog's intuition and emotional intelligence. As the puppies began to leave one by one for their new homes, Margaret's house grew quieter. She would sit in her rocking chair, remembering the chaos and joy of the past few months, her heart full of love for each puppy that had touched her life. Wobbles, now confident and sturdy, went to a family with 3 boisterous boys, where his adventurous spirit would be cherished. Nosy found her home with a retired couple who had a large, fragrant garden for her to explore. Sleepy was adopted by a writer who wanted a calm companion for long days at the desk. Each goodbye was difficult, But Margaret found solace in the joy she saw on the faces of the new families, and in the knowledge that she had found the best possible homes for her charges. The hardest farewell came when it was time for Buddy to leave. The family with the little girl in the wheelchair had indeed decided to adopt him, with plans to train him as a service dog. As Margaret handed over Buddy's leash, the little girl's eyes shone with happiness. "Thank you, Mrs. Olsen," she said shyly. "I promise we'll take really good care of him." Margaret knelt down, looking the girl in the eye. "I know you will, sweetheart. And remember, Buddy is lucky to have you too." As she watched them drive away, Margaret felt a sense of completion. She had seen this journey through, from that cold winter morning to this warm autumn day. She had given these puppies a chance at life, and now she was giving them a chance at happiness with their new families. Returning home, Margaret found the house oddly quiet. For a moment, she felt a pang of loneliness. But then she heard the jingle of Grace's collar as the dog padded into the room, and she smiled. She wasn't alone at all. "Well, girl," she said, sitting down on the floor next to Grace. "Looks like it's just you and me now." Grace laid her head in Margaret's lap, her brown eyes full of love and contentment. In that moment, Margaret knew that while the puppies had moved on to their new lives, her own adventure was far from over. The phone rang, startling them both. It was Sarah from the pet store. "Mrs. Olsen," Sarah said, her voice excited. "I know you've just finished finding homes for Grace's puppies, but I've got a situation here. Someone just brought in a box of kittens they found behind the store. I remembered how wonderful you were with the puppies, and I thought maybe you might be interested in helping out again." Margaret looked down at Grace, who wagged her tail as if in encouragement. A slow smile spread across Margaret's face as she felt a familiar spark of purpose ignite within her. "Kittens, you say?" she replied, her voice warm with anticipation. "Well, Sarah, why don't you bring them over? I think Grace and I might have some room in our hearts for a few more little ones." As she hung up the phone, Margaret felt a surge of excitement. Life, it seemed, was full of unexpected twists and turns. What had started with a mother dog and her puppies had blossomed into something much larger, a new purpose, a reconnect ion with her community, and a heart open to whatever adventure might come next. Grace nuzzled her hand, and Margaret laughed. "Looks like our retirement isn't going to be very quiet after all, girl," she said. "But you know what? I wouldn't have it any other way." And as the autumn sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the windows, Margaret and Grace sat together, ready and waiting for the next chapter in their unexpected journey to begin. The crisp autumn days melted into the chill of another Minnesota winter, but for Margaret Olsen, the warmth of new beginnings lingered in her heart. The house that had once echoed with the pitter-patter of puppy paws was quieter now, but far from empty. Grace, her loyal golden retriever, remained by her side, a constant reminder of the adventure that had changed both their lives. Margaret's days had taken on a new rhythm. Each morning, she and Grace would take their usual walk around the neighborhood, greeting familiar faces and catching up on local news. But now, 3 times a week, they would hop into Margaret's station wagon and make the short drive to the Pine Creek Animal Shelter. It had started with a casual suggestion from Dr. Emily during one of Grace's checkups. "You know, Margaret," she had said, "the shelter is always looking for volunteers. Someone with your experience would be a godsend." The idea had taken root in Margaret's mind, growing stronger with each passing day. She missed the energy and purpose that caring for the puppies had brought to her life. And so, on a chilly Tuesday morning, she had walked into the shelter, Grace at her heel, and offered her services. The shelter staff had welcomed her with open arms. "Mrs. Olsen," exclaimed Jake, the young shelter manager. "We've heard so much about you and your miracle puppies. We'd be honored to have you join our team." And just like that, Margaret found herself embarking on a new chapter of her life. Her first few days at the shelter were a whirlwind of activity. There were dogs to walk, cats to socialize, cages to clean, and a never-ending stream of paperwork to manage. But Margaret threw herself into the work with enthusiasm, her energy belying her 70 years. Grace, too, found a role at the shelter. Her calm demeanor and friendly nature made her the perfect therapy dog for some of the more anxious animals. Margaret would beam with pride as she watched Grace gently approach a trembling chihuahua or sit patiently while a curious kitten batted at her tail. "You're a natural, girl," Margaret would say, giving Grace an affectionate pat. "You're helping these little ones just like I helped you." As the weeks passed, Margaret became a fixture at the shelter. She had a knack for connecting with the animals, especially the older ones that were often overlooked by potential adopters. Her patience and gentle touch seemed to soothe even the most troubled souls. There was Oscar, a grumpy old tomcat with a torn ear and a perpetual scowl. Most volunteers gave him a wide berth, but Margaret saw past his rough exterior. She would sit by his cage, talking softly and offering gentle pets until, one day, Oscar began to purr. "Well, I'll be," Jake had said, shaking his head in amazement. "I've never heard that old grouch make a happy sound before." Then there was Buddy, a three-legged pit bull who had been at the shelter for months. Margaret took a special interest in him, working on obedience training and showering him with affection. Her efforts paid off when a young couple fell in love with Buddy's goofy grin and waggling tail, giving him the forever home he deserved. Word of Margaret's dedication spread through Pine Creek. Soon, she found herself fielding calls from community members seeking advice on pet care or asking for help with animal behavioral issues. She embraced this new role, happy to share the knowledge she had gained through her experiences with Grace and the puppies. Her son, David, noticed the change in his mother during his monthly visits. "Mom, you're glowing," he remarked one Sunday afternoon as they sat on the porch, watching Grace play in the yard. "This volunteer work really agrees with you." Margaret smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I feel like I've found my calling, David," she replied. "Who would have thought that at my age, I'd discover a whole new purpose in life?" But it wasn't always easy. There were days when the reality of animal rescue broke Margaret's heart. The abandoned pets, the abused strays, the difficult decisions that sometimes had to be made, these were the darker sides of her work at the shelter. On those days, she would return home feeling drained and sad. It was during these moments that Grace proved her worth yet again. The golden retriever seemed to sense when Margaret needed comfort, pressing close and offering silent support. Margaret would bury her face in Grace's soft fur, drawing strength from the unconditional love of her faithful companion. "What would I do without you, girl?" she would murmur, and Grace would respond with a gentle lick, as if to say, "You'll never have to find out." As spring returned to Pine Creek, Margaret's impact on the shelter became evident. Adoption rates were up, and the shelter's reputation in the community had never been better. Jake approached her one sunny morning, a smile on his face and a glint in his eye. "Mrs. Olson," he said, "how would you feel about starting a foster program? We've been thinking about it for a while, but we needed someone with the right experience to spearhead it." Margaret felt a thrill of excitement at the prospect. A foster program would allow animals to experience life in a home while waiting for their forever families, reducing stress and increasing their chances of successful adoption. It was a big undertaking, but Margaret knew firsthand the difference a loving temporary home could make. "I'd be honored, Jake," she replied, her mind already whirling with ideas. "When do we start?" The next few weeks were a flurry of activity as Margaret worked with Jake and the shelter staff to set up the foster program. She drew up guidelines, created training materials, and reached out to her network in the community to recruit potential foster families. To kick off the program, Margaret decided to lead by example. She brought home a pair of senior cats, Mildred, a plump tabby with arthritis, and George, a one-eyed black cat with a penchant for naps. Grace welcomed the newcomers with her usual gentle curiosity, and soon the Olsen household settled into a new normal. Margaret's days were fuller than ever. Mornings were spent tending to her foster cats and taking Grace for her walk. Afternoons were dedicated to her work at the shelter, and evenings often involved home visits to check on other foster animals or meetings with potential adopters. Despite the busy schedule, Margaret felt more alive than she had in years. Each successful adoption, each animal saved, brought a sense of fulfillment that she had never experienced before. She was making a real difference in the lives of these animals, and in turn, they were enriching her life in ways she never could have imagined. One evening, as she sat in her favorite armchair, Grace at her feet and Mildred purring in her lap, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. It had all started with a bark in the woods, a desperate mother dog seeking help for her puppies. That single moment had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed Margaret's quiet retirement into a life brimming with purpose and joy. The phone rang, interrupting her reverie. It was Sarah from the pet store. "Mrs. Olsen," she said, her voice excited, "you won't believe this. Remember that family that adopted Buddy, the puppy you trained as a service dog? Well, they're in my store right now, and they're saying Buddy has been absolutely life-changing for their daughter. They wanted me to pass on their thanks." As Margaret hung up the phone, she felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was why she did what she did. This was the power of compassion, of opening one's heart to those in need, be they human or animal. Grace looked up at her, brown eyes full of love and understanding. Margaret reached down to scratch behind her ears. "Well, girl," she said softly, "looks like we found our calling, didn't we? Who would have thought that at our age, we'd become the town's go-to dog whisperers?" Grace's tail thumped against the floor in agreement, and Margaret chuckled. "Life had a funny way of surprising you," she mused. What had started as an act of kindness on a cold winter's day had blossomed into a whole new chapter of her life. And as she looked around at her little family, Grace, Mildred, and George, Margaret knew that this chapter might just be the best one yet. The future stretched out before her, full of promise and purpose. There would be more animals to save, more lives to change, more love to give and receive. And Margaret was ready for it all, her heart open and her spirit strong, eager to see what tomorrow might bring. As the seasons continued to change in Pine Creek, Margaret Olsen's reputation as the town's animal whisperer only grew. What had started with a single act of kindness, taking in Grace and her puppies on that fateful winter morning, had blossomed into something far greater than Margaret could have ever imagined. Now, 2 years after that life-changing day, Margaret's calendar was always full. Between her volunteer work at the shelter, managing the foster program, and the steady stream of community members seeking her advice, she barely had a moment to herself. But Margaret wouldn't have it any other way. One crisp autumn morning, as Margaret and Grace took their usual stroll through the neighborhood, they passed by Pine Creek Elementary School. A group of children were gathered in the playground, and excited whispers rippled through the crowd as they spotted Margaret and Grace. "Mrs. Olsen. Mrs. Olsen," a little girl with pigtails called out, waving enthusiastically. "Can we pet Grace? Please?" Margaret smiled warmly. "Of course, sweetie. Grace loves making new friends." As the children gathered around, eagerly but gently petting Grace's golden fur, Margaret noticed their teacher watching with interest. After the bell rang and the children reluctantly said goodbye to Grace, the teacher approached. "Mrs. Olsen, I'm Ms. Thompson," she introduced herself. "I was wondering if you might be interested in visiting our class sometime. We're doing a unit on community helpers, and I think the children would love to learn about your work with animals." Margaret felt a flutter of excitement at the idea. "I'd be delighted," she replied. "And I'm sure Grace would love to come along too." And so, a new chapter in Margaret's journey began. Her visits to the school became a regular occurrence, not just in Ms. Thompson's class, but throughout the grades. The children were always eager to hear her stories about the animals she'd helped, and Margaret found she had a knack for teaching. She told them about Grace and her puppies, about Oscar the grumpy cat who learned to purr again, about Buddy the three-legged dog who found his forever home. But more than that, she taught them about compassion, responsibility, and the profound impact that kindness can have. "You see, children," she would say, Grace sitting calmly by her side, "every living creature deserves love and respect. When we show kindness to animals, we're not just helping them, we're making the whole world a little bit better." The impact of these lessons soon became apparent. Ms. Thompson reported an increase in students expressing interest in animal welfare. The school started a program where children could read to shelter dogs, helping socialize the animals while improving the kids' reading skills. Margaret's heart swelled with pride when she learned that several families had even adopted pets from the shelter after hearing her speak. But Margaret's influence wasn't limited to the school. Her work continued to touch lives throughout Pine Creek and beyond. The foster program she had started at the shelter was thriving, with a growing network of families opening their homes to animals in need. One day, as Margaret was working at the shelter, she received an unexpected visitor. It was Buddy, the puppy she had helped train as a service dog 2 years ago. His family had brought him in for a visit, and Margaret was amazed at how much he had grown. "Mrs. Olsen," the mother said, tears in her eyes, "we can't thank you enough for what you've done. Buddy has changed our lives in ways we never thought possible. Our daughter is so much more confident and independent now." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat as she watched Buddy, now a handsome adult dog, gently guiding the little girl in the wheelchair. "This," she thought, "this is why we do what we do." As news of Pine Creek's successful animal welfare program spread, Margaret began receiving invitations to speak at events in neighboring towns. At first, the idea of public speaking terrified her. But with Grace by her side and the encouragement of her friends and family, Margaret found the courage to share her experiences. Her talks were never flashy or complicated. Instead, she spoke from the heart, sharing simple stories of the animals she'd helped and the lessons she'd learned along the way. Her sincerity and passion resonated with people, and soon, other communities were reaching out for advice on starting their own foster programs and improving their shelters. Through it all, Grace remained Margaret's constant companion. The golden retriever, now a bit grey around the muzzle but still full of life, seemed to understand the importance of their work. She was always patient with the shelter animals, gentle with the children, and a source of comfort for Margaret during the tough days. One evening, as Margaret sat on her porch swing with Grace at her feet, she reflected on the journey of the past 2 years. The quiet, somewhat lonely life she had led before seemed like a distant memory. Now, her days were filled with purpose, her heart full of love for the animals she helped and the people she'd met along the way. She thought about all the lives that had been touched, the animals who had found loving homes, the children who had learned about compassion, the community that had come together to make a difference. And it had all started with a single act of kindness on a cold winter morning. As if reading her thoughts, Grace lifted her head and placed it on Margaret's lap. Margaret smiled, scratching behind her ears. "You know, girl," she said softly, "I set out to save you and your puppies that day. But the truth is, you saved me too." The next day brought a surprise. Margaret received a call from the mayor's office, inviting her to a town council meeting. Curious and a bit nervous, she attended, with Grace naturally by her side. As she entered the town hall, Margaret was stunned to see it packed with familiar faces, shelter volunteers, school children and their parents, neighbors, and friends. The mayor stood up, a warm smile on his face. "Margaret Olsen," he began, "2 years ago, you took in a stray dog and her puppies, not knowing how that single act would change our community. Today, we want to recognize your tireless efforts and the positive impact you've had on Pine Creek." Margaret listened in awe as the mayor outlined her achievements, the successful shelter foster program, the increased adoption rates, the educational outreach, the inspiration she'd provided to other communities. As he spoke, Margaret felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and appreciation from her neighbors. "And so," the mayor continued, "it is my great pleasure to announce that our new animal welfare center will be named the Margaret Olsen Animal Sanctuary, in honor of the woman who showed us all the power of kindness." The room erupted in applause as Margaret, tears streaming down her face, made her way to the podium. Grace, ever faithful, padded along beside her. As she looked out at the sea of smiling faces, Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude. "Thank you all," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "But this honor doesn't belong to me alone. It belongs to every person who's opened their heart and their home to an animal in need. It belongs to the shelter staff and volunteers who work tirelessly every day. It belongs to the children who are learning to treat all living creatures with kindness and respect." She paused, looking down at Grace. "And it belongs to this wonderful dog right here, who taught me that it's never too late to find a new purpose in life." As Margaret continued her speech, she shared her hope for the future, a future where every animal had a loving home, where kindness and compassion were the norm, not the exception. She spoke of the ripple effect of small acts of kindness, how one good deed could inspire countless others. "Remember," she concluded, "every one of us has the power to make a difference. It might not always be easy, and there will be challenges along the way. But if we approach the world with open hearts and helping hands, there's no limit to the positive change we can create." As she stepped down from the podium to a standing ovation, Margaret felt a sense of peace wash over her. The journey that had begun on that winter morning with a mother dog and her puppies had led her here, to this moment of community, love, and shared purpose. Later that night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she smiled at Grace, who was already curled up on her doggy bed. "Well, girl," she said, "looks like we've started something pretty special here." Grace lifted her head, brown eyes full of love and understanding. In that moment, Margaret knew that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, she was ready to face them. With Grace by her side and the support of her community behind her, she felt stronger than ever. As she drifted off to sleep, Margaret's heart was full. She had discovered, in her golden years, that the power of kindness was truly limitless. It could transform lives, build communities, and create ripples of change that extended far beyond what one could see. And she was grateful, so grateful, to be a part of it all. The Margaret Olson Animal Sanctuary would stand as a testament to what can happen when one person chooses kindness, when a community comes together for a common cause, and when humans and animals form bonds that enrich all their lives. It was a legacy Margaret could be proud of, a reminder that it's never too late to make a difference, and that sometimes, the most unexpected encounters can lead to the most beautiful journeys.